I walked into that engagement party wearing a dress worth more than their mortgage and watched James Sterling's face drain of color the moment he realized I'd been playing him the entire time. For 14 months, I pretended to be a struggling administrative assistant, barely scraping by, and he believed every word because people like the Sterlings never look closely at those they consider beneath them. My name is Sarah Miller, and I'm a senior software architect, earning a salary most people would consider obscene. But when James invited me to meet his family 3 weeks ago, I wore department store clothes and drove my old sedan to their Seattle mansion. My grandmother, Catherine, taught me that lesson before she died. You want to see someone's real character, let them think you're powerless. The test worked better than I ever imagined. Victoria Sterling looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. Her daughter Caroline asked if I needed help identifying which fork to use. And James, the man who claimed to love me, sat there, smiling awkwardly, while his family shredded me piece by piece. But the real revelation came when I overheard them in the study, planning how James would keep me around just long enough to close a business deal with the Ricci family before dumping me for their daughter Isabella. I wasn't his future. I was his placeholder. That was 3 weeks ago. Tonight, standing in this garden filled with Seattle's elite, I'm about to show the Sterling family exactly what happens when you underestimate someone. And trust me, they're going to wish they'd been kinder to the poor girl in the cheap dress. I met James 14 months ago at a coffee shop near Pike Place Market. He was ahead of me in line, and when my card declined because I deliberately left my premium accounts at home that day, he offered to pay for my latte. It was a small gesture, the kind that seems romantic in retrospect, but was probably just him showing off. He asked for my number. I gave it to him. Our first date was at a mid-range Italian restaurant, where he ordered wine that I knew cost less than the bottle I'd opened alone the night before. He talked about his family's car dealership business with a mixture of pride and something else I couldn't quite identify then. Now I recognize it as desperation. The second date, the third, a month of them. James was attentive in that careful way of someone who's been coached. He always texted back promptly, always asked about my day, always made sure to split the check or let me pay sometimes, because, as he explained, he respected my independence. I found that charming then. Now I know he was just making sure I didn't think he expected me to be a financial burden. I kept up my performance perfectly. I lived in a modest apartment in Ballard, drove a 12-year-old Honda, shopped at Target. None of it was a lie exactly. I owned that apartment. Bought it cash 5 years ago, as an investment property. The Honda was my first car, the one I'd worked 3 jobs to afford in college, and I kept it for sentimental reasons. My real home was a penthouse downtown that I'd purchased under an LLC, but James never needed to know that. 6 months in, he started talking about meeting his family. He built it up carefully, warning me that his mother could be difficult, that they had certain expectations, that old Seattle money came with old Seattle attitudes. He made it sound like he was protecting me, preparing me. What he was really doing was giving me advance warning that I wasn't going to be good enough. I decided right then to accelerate my test. I went shopping at discount stores, picked out the most ordinary clothes I could find. I studied how to make myself smaller, less polished, more forgettable. My grandmother had been a psychology professor before she made her fortune in early tech investments, and she'd taught me that people reveal their truth when they think there's no cost to cruelty. The invitation came in October. Dinner at the Sterling Estate in Medina, one of those neighborhoods where the houses hide behind gates, and the property values make headlines. James picked me up in his BMW, kissed my cheek, told me I looked beautiful, even though I could see the slight hesitation in his eyes when he took in my off-the-rack dress and drugstore makeup. During the drive, he coached me. His mother appreciated directness, but not boldness. His father liked to talk about golf and sailing. His sister, Caroline, was protective of the family reputation. Every word of advice was another brick in the wall between who they were and who they thought I was. By the time we pulled through their gates, I understood completely that this wasn't a dinner invitation. It was an evaluation. The house was exactly what I expected. Old money trying desperately to look like new money, with renovations that cost a fortune but somehow made everything look cheaper. Crystal chandeliers that were too modern for the crown molding. Marble floors that clashed with the traditional furniture. It was the house of people who had money once and were spending what was left, trying to prove they still did. Victoria answered the door herself, which should have been my first clue. Families like this usually had staff. She looked me up and down with an expression I'd seen before in boardrooms. That particular mix of dismissal and disgust that powerful people reserve for those they consider inconsequential. That's when I knew for certain this family was going to show me exactly who they were, and I was going to let them. Victoria led us into a dining room that felt more like a museum than a place where people ate. The table could have seated 20, but it was set for just 5 of us, which somehow made the whole space feel even more oppressive. Charles Sterling stood when we entered, tall and silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came from decades of convincing himself he was more important than he actually was. Caroline arrived last, dripping in diamonds that I recognized as good quality, but poor taste. The kind of jewelry people bought when they wanted to display wealth rather than possess beauty. The interrogation started before the first course arrived. Victoria wanted to know where I'd gone to college, what my parents did, where I'd grown up. Each answer I gave was met with a slight pursing of her lips, a barely perceptible exchange of glances with Charles. I'd attended state school on a full scholarship. My parents had been middle class, both gone now. I'd grown up in Spokane, not Seattle. None of it was good enough. I could see that calculation happening behind Victoria's eyes. The adding up of my worth and finding it insufficient. Caroline joined in, asking about my job with that particular tone that made it clear she already knew the answer would disappoint her. When I told her I was an administrative assistant, she actually laughed and said something about how nice it must be to have such a simple job, no real stress or responsibility. James said nothing. He cut his steak and smiled and occasionally nodded, but he never once defended me, never once suggested that perhaps his family was being rude. I watched him shrink under his mother's presence, becoming less of the man who charmed me in coffee shops, and more of a boy desperate for approval. Charles wanted to talk about the family business. Sterling Luxury Motors, he called it, though I'd already done enough research to know they were struggling. 3 dealerships across Washington, all hemorrhaging money in an age when people bought cars online and luxury meant Tesla, not the European imports the Sterling specialized in. He spoke about legacy and tradition, while I mentally reviewed the financial statements I'd pulled from public records. They were 6 months from bankruptcy if they didn't find an infusion of capital. The dinner dragged on through 4 courses, each one another opportunity for the Sterling family to make their position clear. I wasn't welcome. I wasn't suitable. I was a mistake James had made that they would tolerate until they could correct it. Caroline made a joke about teaching me which fork to use for fish, and Victoria actually smiled. After the main course, I excused myself to use the bathroom. Victoria gave me directions with the kind of careful patience you'd use with a child, pointing down the hall and reminding me to return promptly for dessert. I walked slowly, taking in the details of the house. Family photos lined the hallway, all of them carefully staged and professionally shot. The Sterlings at charity galas, the Sterlings on a yacht, the Sterlings accepting some community service award. In every single photo, they were smiling, but none of the smiles reached their eyes. The bathroom was at the end of the hall, but I noticed light coming from under a door to my left. A study or office, I assumed, and voices. I shouldn't have stopped. I should have kept walking, but something in the tone made me pause, made me press closer to that door, made me listen. Victoria's voice was different than it had been at dinner. Colder, sharper, more honest. She was talking about me, about the dinner, about her disappointment in James for bringing someone so obviously unsuitable into their home. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. She was talking about a plan, about keeping me around, about a timeline, about another woman named Isabella Ricci, daughter of Marco Ricci, owner of the largest luxury car import business on the West Coast, about a merger that would save the Sterling dealerships from bankruptcy, about James marrying Isabella once the contracts were signed. And then I heard James respond, heard him agree, heard him call me naive and easy to manage, heard him laugh about how I had no idea what was really happening. I stood in that hallway with my hand on the wall, my cheap dress suddenly feeling like armor instead of camouflage, and understood that my grandmother's test had revealed something far worse than simple snobbery. The Sterlings weren't just cruel, they were calculating, and I'd just become collateral damage in their financial desperation. I walked back to that dining room with a smile on my face and murder in my heart. Victoria looked up when I entered, and I could have sworn I saw a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. But I sat down smoothly and complimented the bathroom's marble countertops. Caroline made another snide comment about my ability to navigate their house without getting lost, and I laughed like she'd said something genuinely funny. James reached for my hand under the table. I let him take it. I let him squeeze my fingers, while his mother served tiramisu and talked about the importance of family loyalty. I let him drive me home, while he apologized for his family's intensity, explaining that they were just protective, that they'd warm up to me eventually, that I needed to understand their world operated differently than mine. I nodded in all the right places. I kissed him goodnight outside my apartment building. I watched him drive away in his BMW, and the moment his taillights disappeared around the corner, I went inside and started working. My real apartment, the penthouse, had a home office that most executives would envy, 3 monitors, fiber optic internet, access to databases, and research tools that came with my actual career. I'd built a reputation in tech by being thorough, by seeing patterns others missed, by understanding that information was power. Now I was going to use every single one of those skills to dissect the Sterling family. I started with the basics: public records, business filings, property deeds. Sterling Luxury Motors was even worse off than I'd suspected. They'd taken out a second mortgage on the Medina house 6 months ago. Charles had personally guaranteed loans the dealerships couldn't repay. They'd laid off half their staff in the past year, but kept spending money on maintaining appearances. The charity galas, the country club membership, Caroline's jewelry. Then I found the Ricci connection. Marco Ricci owned Pacific Luxury Imports, the company that supplied most of the high-end European cars on the West Coast. He'd been in talks with the Sterlings about a merger for 8 months, but the deal kept stalling. I found an interview with Ricci from a trade publication where he mentioned wanting to expand into the Seattle market, but being cautious about partnerships. Isabella Ricci was easy to research. 28 Stanford MBA, her father's heir apparent. Her social media was private, but her professional profile showed someone serious about business, someone who probably had no idea she was being positioned as a sacrificial lamb in someone else's financial rescue plan. I dug deeper into Caroline. Her credit cards were maxed out. She had accounts at every luxury store in Seattle. But there was something else. Transactions that didn't fit the pattern of a shopping addiction. Large cash withdrawals. Payments to an LLC, registered in Nevada. I followed that thread and found myself looking at an online gambling operation. Caroline wasn't just spending the family money. She was stealing it. Over the next 3 days, I built a complete picture of the Sterling family's desperation. The dealerships were 3 months behind on their lease payments. Victoria had sold her mother's jewelry collection through a private dealer. Charles's golf club membership was about to be revoked for unpaid dues. They were drowning, and the Ricci merger was their only life raft. James called every day. He wanted to take me to dinner, to make up for his family's behavior, to show me that he was different from them. I agreed to every date. I wore my discount clothes and paid with my declining balance debit card and played my role perfectly. He never suspected that between our dates, I was systematically destroying his family's escape plan. I found Caroline's gambling accounts, $50,000 in March, $30,000 in June, another $40,000 in August. She'd been embezzling from the dealership accounts, covering it up with creative bookkeeping that wouldn't survive a real audit. I documented every transaction, every falsified entry, every fraudulent transfer. Then I did something that surprised even me. I called Isabella Ricci's office and scheduled a meeting, claiming to be a business consultant with information about the Sterling merger. Her assistant put me through to Isabella herself, who sounded curious and cautious in equal measure. We agreed to meet for coffee the following week. James proposed on a Friday evening in November. We were at a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, and he got down on one knee with a ring that I estimated cost about $3,000. Decent, but not impressive. The kind of ring a man bought when he was trying to look generous while conserving capital. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to build a life together, that I made him happier than he'd ever been. I said yes. I let him slide that ring onto my finger. I let him kiss me while the other diners applauded, and I felt absolutely nothing except a cold, clear sense of purpose. Victoria called the next morning to tell me she was planning an engagement party. Her voice had a forced brightness that didn't quite hide her dismay. She suggested the third Saturday in December, at the house, a small gathering of family and close friends. She made it sound like a generous offer. I knew it was one last chance to humiliate me before James upgraded to Isabella Ricci. I told her it sounded perfect. I asked if I could bring anything. She said just myself, and assured me the Sterling family would handle all the details. I hung up and looked at my ring, that inadequate little diamond, and smiled. They were going to handle the details. Perfect. That gave me 3 weeks to handle mine. Isabella Ricci met me at a cafe in Pioneer Square on a Tuesday morning. She was exactly what her professional photos suggested. Polished, intelligent, direct. When I told her I had information about the Sterling merger, she leaned forward with an intensity that told me everything I needed to know. Isabella wasn't naive. She was suspicious. I showed her the financial statements first, the ones that painted the real picture of Sterling Luxury Motors, not the doctored versions her father's team had been given, but the actual numbers showing 3 failing dealerships and debt that exceeded their assets by a factor of 2. She pulled out her tablet and started taking notes, asking sharp questions about my sources and methodology. Then I told her about James, about the conversation I'd overheard, about the plan to use her as a financial solution, about my role as the temporary distraction. I expected anger or denial, But instead, she nodded slowly and said something that surprised me. She'd suspected something was off. The timeline was too convenient. The pressure from her father, too sudden. Victoria Sterling had been pushing hard for a wedding date before any business contracts were finalized. We talked for 2 hours. By the end, we had an understanding. Isabella would tell her father about the Sterling family's real financial situation, which would kill the merger. But more than that, she would make sure certain people in Seattle's business community knew exactly why the Ricci family was walking away from the deal. Reputation mattered in their world. The Sterlings were about to discover how much. While Isabella handled the business side, I focused on Caroline. I'd found her gambling accounts, but I needed proof that would hold up legally. I hired a forensic accountant, someone discreet who specialized in embezzlement cases. I gave him copies of the Sterling dealership accounts and Caroline's personal transactions. He worked for 4 days and came back with a report that was more damaging than I'd hoped. Caroline hadn't just stolen from the dealerships. She'd created fake vendor accounts, submitted fraudulent invoices, and funneled almost $500,000 into her gambling addiction over the course of 18 months. The accountant laid it out in a document that was both comprehensive and damning. With this evidence, Caroline was facing serious criminal charges. I made an appointment with a lawyer, one who specialized in fraud cases. I explained the situation carefully, framing it as a concerned citizen, bringing evidence of a crime to light. The lawyer reviewed the forensic accountant's report, asked detailed questions about my sources, and finally told me that this was actionable. He could take this to the authorities, and they would almost certainly investigate. More than that, he could make sure the investigation started immediately, which meant Caroline would be facing legal consequences right around the time of my engagement party. James became more attentive as December approached. He called every night, took me to dinner 3 times a week, talked about our future together. He wanted to look at apartments in Capitol Hill, places that would be affordable for us, he said. I pretended to be excited, while mentally calculating that I could buy the entire building he was showing me. Victoria called to discuss engagement party details. She wanted to make sure I understood the dress code, the guest list, the expectations. She spoke to me like I was a child preparing for her first adult event. I assured her I understood perfectly. She seemed satisfied. Caroline sent a text, inviting me to go shopping for a dress. She suggested we look at outlet stores, places where I could find something appropriate without spending too much. I agreed to meet her, but cancelled at the last minute, claiming a work emergency. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of watching me pretend to struggle with price tags. The lawyer called me on a Wednesday. The authorities had accepted the evidence and were opening an investigation into Caroline Sterling's financial activities. He couldn't tell me exact timing, but he suggested that formal charges would likely be filed within the next 10 days. I thanked him and hung up, my hands shaking slightly, despite my calm voice. Everything was falling into place. Isabella had told her father about the Sterling family's real situation. Marco Ricci had called Charles Sterling personally to withdraw from merger discussions, citing concerns about financial transparency. I knew this because James mentioned it one night over dinner, complaining about his father's stress and some deal that had fallen through. He had no idea it was connected to me, to us, to any of it. The dealerships were in free fall. Without the Ricci merger, they had no way to refinance their debt. Charles was scrambling, calling in favors, trying to find another investor. Victoria was suddenly absent from her usual charity events. The Sterling family was circling the drain, and they still thought I was too stupid to notice. I went shopping for a dress, not at an outlet store, not at a department store, but at a private boutique in downtown Seattle, where they kept pieces from New York and Paris fashion weeks. I tried on 6 before I found the right one. Emerald green, custom fitted, the kind of dress that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. The sales associate didn't even tell me the price. People who shopped there didn't need to ask. I had the dress delivered to my penthouse. Then I went to my safe and pulled out my grandmother's sapphire necklace, the one she'd worn to the tech conference where she'd met the venture capitalists who made her first million. The sapphires were Burmese, the setting was platinum, and the whole piece had been appraised at $400,000. I hadn't worn it since her funeral. 3 days before the engagement party, I met with one more person, a reporter who covered Seattle business news. I gave her background information about the Sterling family's financial troubles, Caroline's embezzlement, and the collapsed Ricci merger. I provided documentation for everything, including the forensic accountant's report. She told me it would take time to verify and publish, but I said I didn't need it published immediately. I just needed her to be at the Sterling estate on Saturday evening with a photographer. There was going to be a story, I promised. She'd want to be there to see it firsthand. Friday night, James came over to my apartment. He was nervous, talking about the party, about wanting everything to be perfect. He kissed me and told me he couldn't wait to show me off to everyone. I smiled and said I was looking forward to it too. After he left, I stayed up until 3 a.m, going over every detail of my plan. The dress, the necklace, the evidence, the timing. Isabella had agreed to make an appearance at the party with her father. The lawyer had confirmed that Caroline's arrest warrant would be executed Saturday morning, though he'd arranged for the actual arrest to be delayed until evening for maximum impact. The reporter was confirmed to attend. Everything was ready. The Sterlings had invited Seattle's elite to witness what they thought would be my final humiliation. Instead, they were about to learn what it felt like to be powerless in front of people whose opinions actually mattered. Saturday morning, I woke up early and went for a run along the waterfront. The December air was cold and clear, and I could see my breath in clouds as I ran. My mind was perfectly calm. Tonight, the Sterling family would finally meet the real Sarah Miller, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The morning of the engagement party, I received a text from Victoria. She wanted me to arrive early to help with preparations, which was her polite way of saying she wanted to inspect me before the guests arrived. I told her I'd be there by 4, giving myself just enough time to make an entrance. When the party was already in full swing, I spent the day at my penthouse, taking care of final details. The reporter confirmed she'd be there at 5:30, with her photographer, positioned to capture everything. Isabella sent a message saying she and her father would arrive at 6, fashionably late, but impossible to miss. The timing was going to be perfect. My lawyer called one last time to walk through the sequence. Caroline's arrest warrant was active, but the officers had agreed to delay execution until I gave them a signal. I'd suggested they position themselves outside the Sterling estate around 6:15, ready to move in when I called. The lawyer sounded uncertain about the theatrical nature of it all, but I reminded him that Caroline's crimes were real and documented. The timing was just about ensuring the right people witnessed the consequences. I laid out the emerald dress on my bed. Next to it, the sapphire necklace caught the afternoon light, each stone glinting with cold blue fire. I'd chosen sapphires specifically because they were Victoria's birthstone, and I wanted her to see exactly what real wealth looked like when I returned her condescension with facts. At 3 o'clock, I started getting ready, hair pulled back in a simple chignon, makeup understated but flawless, nails done in a neutral shade. The dress slid on like it had been made for me, which it had. The necklace settled against my collarbone with a familiar weight, and I stood looking at myself in the mirror. seeing my grandmother's determination reflected back at me. My phone rang. James, calling to see where I was and why I wasn't there yet. I told him I was running a bit behind. Traffic was terrible. I'd be there as soon as I could. He sounded stressed but tried to hide it, reminding me that his mother really wanted me there early. I promised I was coming and hung up. I picked up the folder I'd prepared, thick with documentation, Caroline's embezzlement evidence, the forensic accountant's report, bank statements, transaction records, everything organized and labeled. I'd made 3 copies, one for the police, one for the reporter, and one for the guests at the party. The evidence was irrefutable. Caroline had stolen nearly $500,000 from the family business, and every penny could be traced. At 4:30, I pulled up to the Sterling estate in my Honda. The valet looked confused when I handed him the keys to a 12-year-old car, clearly expecting something else, given the caliber of vehicles already lining their circular drive. I could see luxury sedans and sports cars, the kind of machines the Seattle elite drove to prove they belonged. My little Honda looked like it had taken a wrong turn. The transformation was about to begin. I could hear music floating from the garden, see caterers moving through the house with trays of champagne. Victoria had gone all out for this party, spending money they didn't have to maintain the illusion of wealth and status. The white tents on the lawn looked like something from a magazine spread, complete with an orchestra and enough flowers to stock a florist shop for a month. I walked around to the side of the house, away from the main entrance, and made my way to the garden through a service gate. I wanted to see the party before anyone saw me, wanted to understand the battlefield before the battle began, and what I saw was exactly what I'd expected. 200 of Seattle's most influential people, all dressed in their finest, all there to witness what they thought would be my integration into their world. James spotted me first. He started walking toward me, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. He'd seen the Honda, seen my late arrival, and he was probably preparing to smooth things over with his mother. But then he got close enough to really see me, and his steps slowed. The dress, the necklace, the way I was standing, no longer trying to make myself smaller. Victoria was next, her eyes traveling from my face to the necklace, and then back again, her expression shifting from annoyance to something harder to read. Caroline turned from her conversation with a group of women, her mouth falling open slightly, when she saw the sapphires around my neck. Charles's glass of scotch paused halfway to his mouth. The moment crystallized around me. The music continued playing. The guests kept talking, but in the small circle of space where the Sterling family stood, everything had stopped. They were finally seeing me, really seeing me, and understanding that they'd made a terrible mistake. Isabella arrived with her father, right on schedule. Marco Ricci was tall and silver-haired, his presence commanding immediate attention. Isabella was beside him, elegant in navy blue, her expression carefully neutral. They made their way through the crowd, and I watched Victoria's face drain of color when she realized the Riccis were at her party. At the engagement party for the son who was supposed to marry their daughter instead of me. The reporter was there too. I could see her near the edge of the crowd with her photographer, both of them positioned to capture everything. She caught my eye and gave a small nod. She was ready. James reached me, his hands outstretched, his voice low and urgent. He wanted to know what I was doing, why I was dressed like this, where I'd gotten that necklace, why I was late. I could hear the panic underneath his questions, the dawning realization that something was very wrong with his careful plans. Victoria appeared at his shoulder, her smile rigid and false. She said something about needing to get started with the toasts, about wanting me to stand up with the family for photos, about keeping to the schedule. but her eyes were on my necklace, calculating its worth. Understanding that it changed everything she'd assumed about me, the servers began directing guests toward the main tent, where a small stage had been set up. This was the moment Victoria had planned carefully. The public celebration of her son's engagement to a woman she considered beneath him. The opportunity to display their family's graciousness in accepting someone so clearly unsuitable. She'd probably already prepared her speech, full of backhanded compliments and subtle put-downs disguised as welcome. I let them guide me toward the stage. James kept one hand on my elbow, probably afraid I'd disappear if he let go. We climbed the 3 steps to the platform, and Victoria took her position at the microphone, tapping it gently to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, 200 faces turning toward us with polite interest. Victoria began her speech, and it was exactly what I'd expected. She welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, talked about family and tradition, and the importance of welcoming new people into the Sterling circle. She managed to mention my humble background 3 times in 2 minutes, always framing it as something admirable, something that showed character. But underneath every word was the clear implication that I was lucky to be there, fortunate that they'd accepted me, despite my obvious shortcomings. Then she turned to me and extended the microphone, inviting me to say a few words. The smile on her face was triumphant. This was her final test, her last chance to watch me fumble and stumble in front of people who mattered. She probably expected me to thank her nervously, to acknowledge how grateful I was, to confirm everything she'd been saying about my place in their world. I took the microphone from her hand and felt my grandmother's necklace shift against my skin. The weight of it reminded me exactly who I was and what I was about to do. The Sterling family's reckoning was about to begin. I looked out at those 200 faces and felt absolutely calm. This was what all those board meetings had trained me for, speaking truth to power. While they were still figuring out that the power had shifted, Victoria stood beside me, her confident smile starting to waver as I failed to immediately launch into grateful platitudes. I started by thanking the Sterlings for their hospitality, my voice clear and steady through the sound system. I mentioned how much I'd learned from them in these past weeks, how educational it had been to see how certain families operated, how they treated people they considered beneath them. A ripple went through the crowd. That wasn't the tone of a grateful fiancé. Then I addressed the obvious question everyone was too polite to ask. Yes, I'd arrived in an old car. Yes, I'd been wearing discount clothes at our first dinner. Yes, I'd presented myself as someone struggling financially. I paused, letting the tension build, watching James's face go pale beside me. But those were choices, I explained, deliberate choices to test character. My grandmother taught me that you learn who people really are when they think you have nothing to offer them. The Sterling family had taught me exactly that lesson. I could see Victoria trying to interrupt, trying to take back the microphone, but I'd moved away from her reach. I told the crowd about my real job, about being a senior software architect at one of Seattle's most successful tech companies. I watched comprehension dawn on faces throughout the garden. Some of these people probably knew my name from industry events, from publications, from the patents I held. Then I mentioned the salary, the stock options, the investment portfolio my grandmother had started teaching me to build when I was 16. I explained that I could, quite literally, purchase the Sterling estate for cash if I wanted to. The collective gasp was audible. James reached for me, saying my name, but I moved away from him too. I wasn't finished. I told them about the conversation I'd overheard, about Victoria and James planning to keep me around just long enough to close a business deal with the Ricci family. about James's intention to marry Isabella Ricci instead. Once her father's money had saved the Sterling dealerships from bankruptcy, about being called naive and easy to manage. Marco Ricci stood up from his table. He looked at Charles Sterling with an expression of disgust that needed no translation. Isabella was beside him, her hand on his arm, both of them watching the stage with satisfaction. They'd known this was coming. They'd agreed to be here to witness it. But I wasn't done. I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying, the one with all of Caroline's financial crimes documented inside. I explained how I'd discovered that the Sterling family's financial problems weren't just poor business management. Caroline had been systematically stealing from the company for 18 months, nearly $500,000, funneled into gambling accounts while she wore diamonds and judged my department store clothes. Caroline made a sound, something between a gasp and a denial. But I was already holding up bank statements, transaction records, everything highlighted and labeled. I announced that I'd already provided this evidence to the authorities, and that Caroline would be facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. As if on cue, I saw the police officers entering through the garden gate. I'd texted them the signal 5 minutes before Victoria had invited me to the stage. Perfect timing. They moved through the crowd, and Caroline saw them coming. She tried to run, actually tried to push through the guests toward the house. But the officers were faster. The crowd watched in shocked silence as Caroline was handcuffed right there in the garden, in front of Seattle's elite, in the middle of what was supposed to be a celebration. The officers read her rights, and I saw several guests pulling out their phones, recording everything. This would be all over social media within the hour. I turned back to the microphone. I mentioned that the Sterling dealerships had lost their operating licenses that morning. I'd provided evidence to the licensing board about the company's financial instability, Caroline's embezzlement, and the falsified records they'd been using to appear more solvent than they were. The board had acted swiftly. Sterling Luxury Motors was effectively finished. Charles was white-faced, his hand gripping the back of a chair. Victoria looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. James stood frozen, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his carefully constructed denial. I took off the engagement ring, that cheap little diamond that was supposed to seal my fate as the placeholder girlfriend. I held it up for everyone to see, then set it carefully on the edge of the stage. I told James that I hoped Isabella had a strong stomach, because she was going to need it if she ever made the mistake of trusting him. The reporter was getting everything, her photographer's camera clicking constantly. This would be in tomorrow's business section, a cautionary tale about families who tried to maintain appearances while their foundation crumbled. I picked up my grandmother's sapphire necklace with one hand, feeling its weight, its history, its reminder that real worth had nothing to do with what other people thought of you. Then I walked off that stage, through the crowd of stunned guests, past the police officers, leading Caroline away, past Victoria's frozen expression and Charles's devastated one. James called my name. I didn't turn around. There was nothing left to say to him. No explanation he could offer that would matter. He'd shown me exactly who he was, and I'd shown him the cost of that choice. I walked to my old Honda, still parked in the Circle Drive with all those luxury cars. The valet scrambled to bring me my keys, his eyes wide with everything he'd just witnessed. I tipped him $100, probably more than he made in a day, and he took it with shaking hands. As I drove away from the Sterling estate, I could see the chaos in my rearview mirror. Guests fleeing, police cars with lights flashing, reporters surrounding Victoria and Charles. The carefully constructed image of the Sterling family was disintegrating in real time, and I'd been the one to strike the match, My phone started ringing immediately. James, calling over and over, each call going to voicemail. I didn't listen to any of them. There was nothing he could say that I wanted to hear. I drove back to my penthouse, took off the emerald dress, and put on sweatpants and a t-shirt. I made tea in my kitchen overlooking Elliott Bay, watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark water. Somewhere out there, the Sterling family was dealing with the consequences of their cruelty, their manipulation, their belief that some people didn't deserve basic human dignities. I'd lost a fiancé, but I'd found something much more valuable. The absolute certainty that I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small. The test had worked exactly as my grandmother had promised. The Sterlings had shown me who they really were. And I'd shown them what happened when you underestimated the wrong person. The story hit the Seattle Times business section the next morning. The reporter had worked fast, combining photos from the engagement party with details about the Sterling dealership's collapse and Caroline's arrest. The headline read, "Sterling Empire Crumbles, Embezzlement, Fraud, and a Wedding That Never Was." By noon, it had been picked up by 3 national business outlets. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. James called 47 times that first day. Victoria left voicemails that started angry and ended desperate. Caroline's lawyer tried to reach me, hoping I'd consider not pressing charges. I blocked every number, changed my voicemail to full, and let the chaos settle without my participation. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Caroline pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. She got 3 years, with the possibility of parole in 18 months. The Sterling family had to sell the Medina house to pay restitution. Victoria and Charles moved to a condo in Bellevue. Their social standing in Seattle permanently destroyed. The dealerships were liquidated. Employees lost their jobs, which bothered me more than anything else about the situation. But I'd documented their employment records and severance, and I made anonymous donations to a fund, helping them transition to new positions. It wasn't my responsibility to fix the Sterling family's mess, but the workers hadn't deserved to suffer for their employers' crimes. James tried one last time to reach me, showing up at my office building a month after the party. Security called me before letting him into the lobby, and I told them to have him removed from the property. I watched from my window as he stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building, and then finally walked away. I felt nothing watching him go. That chapter had closed. Isabella sent me a gift basket with a note that just said, "Thank you for the heads up. You saved me from a disaster." I appreciated the acknowledgement. We met for coffee again, this time as acquaintances who'd helped each other dodge bullets. She told me her father had used the Sterling situation as a teaching moment about due diligence in business relationships. I told her about my grandmother's test, and she laughed, saying she might borrow that strategy for her own life. Work became my focus again. I'd taken a week off after the engagement party, needing time to process everything. But when I returned, I threw myself into a new project with renewed energy. My colleagues welcomed me back without questions, and I was grateful for the professional space where my competence mattered more than my personal drama. The sapphire necklace went back into my safe. I'd wear it again someday, but for now, it had served its purpose. It had reminded me of my worth at exactly the moment I needed that reminder most. Spring came to Seattle, and with it, a kind of peace I hadn't expected. I started dating again, casually, with new rules. I was honest about who I was from the first date. I wore clothes from my real closet, drove my actual car, talked about my job without downplaying it. If someone couldn't handle my success, they didn't deserve my time. I bought a house on Bainbridge Island, a contemporary place with water views and enough space for the life I actually wanted to live. Not a mansion trying to prove something, but a home that felt like mine. I set up a proper home office, adopted a dog from the shelter, planted a garden that would bloom in summer. The Honda finally died in June. I'd been driving it more out of habit than necessity, but when the transmission gave out, I decided it was time. I donated it to a vocational school where students could learn mechanics, and I bought myself a Tesla. Nothing flashy, just efficient and fitting for who I'd become. On what would have been my wedding day, I took myself to the spa. Full day package, massage, facial, the works, while lying on that heated table with cucumber slices on my eyes. I thought about the Sterling family and felt nothing but relief. I'd dodged something worse than a bad marriage. I'd escaped a family that would have spent decades trying to diminish me. My grandmother's test had worked perfectly. It had revealed the Sterling family's true nature before I'd legally tied myself to them. And more than that, it had revealed something about myself. I was strong enough to walk away from someone I'd thought I loved when I discovered he didn't deserve me. That night, I sat on my deck, watching the sunset over Puget Sound, my dog asleep at my feet, a glass of wine in my hand. I thought about Victoria's face when she'd realized who I really was, about James's panic when his careful plans collapsed, about Caroline being led away in handcuffs while wearing diamonds paid for with stolen money. I didn't take pleasure in their suffering, but I didn't regret my actions either. They'd made choices based on cruelty and greed. I'd simply made sure those choices had consequences. The stars came out over the water, and I pulled my sweater closer against the evening chill. Somewhere in Seattle, the Sterling family was dealing with their reduced circumstances, their criminal records, their shattered reputation. I hoped they'd learned something from the experience, though I doubted it. People like that rarely did, but I'd learned plenty. I'd learned that my grandmother was right about character revealing itself. When people thought you had nothing to offer, I'd learned that I could trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I'd learned that I was capable of strategic thinking under pressure, and that I could execute a plan with precision when necessary. Most importantly, I'd learned that I didn't need to make myself smaller to make someone else comfortable. The right person would celebrate my success, not feel threatened by it. The right family would welcome me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. I went inside eventually, the dog following at my heels, and locked the door on a day that should have been my wedding. Instead, it was just another evening in a life I'd built on my own terms, with my own money, answering to no one but myself. The Sterling family had thought they were getting a desperate, naive woman who'd be grateful for their acceptance. Instead, they'd encountered someone who knew her worth and refused to settle for less than she deserved. I fell asleep that night in my own house, in my own bed, with my own dog snoring softly in the corner, and I realized that losing James Sterling was the best thing that had ever happened to me. If you've been following this journey, I want to know, where are you hearing this from? What city are you in right now? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you want to make sure you don't miss stories like this, stories about people who refuse to accept less than they deserved, subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just living well and walking away from people who never deserved you in the first place. That's exactly what I did, and I've never looked back.